The Young and the Restless spoilers. The story had always been unpredictable in Genoa City, but what was unfolding in Nice carried a sense of darkness that even the most seasoned observers could not have foreseen. For weeks there had been whispers, vague mentions of Jill's absence, her silence, her refusal to appear even when the family expected her presence at a critical moment. Cain, on the other hand, seemed to thrive in the shadows of that absence, walking with an air of smug confidence, his demeanor as though he had orchestrated a grand design in which every move had been carefully calculated to his advantage. His laughter rang hollow, his self-satisfaction was written all over his face, and those who paid attention could feel that beneath that facade there was more than simple joy. It felt like a trap was being set, an invisible net slowly tightening around someone who had not yet realized the danger approaching. Jill had always been a force of nature, a woman of fire and calculation, but the truth was she could never trust Cain fully, not with his history, not with the way ambition seemed to seep out of every pore of his being. She had often thought about how dangerous his hunger for control could become, how destructive his schemes might prove if left unchecked. Yet even she could not have predicted the true extent of what he was capable of when desperation and greed collided with opportunity. When news first broke that Jill had not been seen in Nice despite her plans to travel, there was confusion at first, followed quickly by suspicion. Some assumed she had delayed her trip, others that she was simply buying time, weighing her options, but in truth, the reality was far more sinister. While Cain walked about with his triumphant glow, Jill was enduring something far darker, and it was only when she reappeared, battered, broken, and bloodied, that the truth began to take shape. Billy had grown numb to the constant weight of his mother's criticisms over the years. Jill had never hidden her doubts about him, always treating him as though he would never measure up, always layering her love with disappointment, as if expecting him to fail was a maternal instinct. He had lived with it so long that he told himself he no longer cared, that her dismissive words could not reach him anymore. But when she finally did arrive in Nice, stumbling, injured, desperate enough to fall into his arms without words, Billy realized just how much her opinion still mattered, how much her suffering could ignite a fire within him that nothing else ever had. The sight of Jill, bruised and wounded, cut deep into the very core of his being. His arms wrapped around her instinctively, his heart pounding with fear and rage as he whispered questions she could not answer. Her body trembled, her lips tried to move, but no words came. Within moments she collapsed into unconsciousness, leaving Billy with more questions than answers and a heart full of rage that demanded to be unleashed on whoever had done this. It did not take long for suspicions to harden into conviction. Cain had been too pleased, too comfortable, too confident, and now his mask was slipping. Billy's instincts screamed that Cain had orchestrated this horror, that he had dragged Jill into something vile and manipulative, using her as leverage to prop up his own ambitions. The very idea filled Billy with disgust, his hands shaking as he tried to process how far Cain had gone. To control Jill, to harm her physically and emotionally, to reduce her to this broken state, it was unforgivable, beyond redemption, an act that confirmed Cain's corruption had no limits. What was once just rivalry or bitterness between them had now transformed into something far more dangerous, a vendetta. Billy could not look at Cain without imagining the cruel hand that had orchestrated Jill's suffering, without seeing him as the monster who had crossed a line that no one could return from. And in that moment, Billy vowed that he would take revenge, that he would burn down whatever fortress Cain had built for himself, that he would not stop until his mother was safe and her tormentor paid in full. The tension in Nice escalated as news of Jill's condition spread. She remained unconscious for days, her body bearing the marks of a brutal ordeal, her silence a torment to those who wanted answers. Billy sat by her side through every hour, staring at her face, replaying every moment of his strained relationship with her, every argument, every disappointment, every rejection. The pain of their history weighed heavily on him, but now it was fused with a protective fury that left no room for hesitation. For once in his life, he was certain of what he had to do. This was not about proving himself to Jill, not about winning her approval or disproving her doubts. This was about justice, about making Cain answer for what he had done, about taking control of a narrative that had been poisoned by deceit and cruelty. Cain, meanwhile, continued his act, speaking with charm, carrying himself with confidence, pretending as though he was nothing more than a man enjoying the fruits of his success. But those who knew how to read between the lines could sense the tension underneath his smile, the way his eyes darted nervously when certain subjects arose, the way his laughter sounded more forced as Billy's presence grew more intense. Cain had built a trap, but what he had not calculated was Billy's resolve once his family was under threat. He had underestimated how far Billy was willing to go when pushed beyond the edge, and in that miscalculation lay his greatest danger. Billy had become a man with nothing left to lose but everything to protect. As the days unfolded, the confrontation became inevitable. Billy no longer cared about discretion or strategy. He wanted Cain to feel the weight of his rage, to understand that every bruise on Jill's body was a debt that needed to be repaid. He confronted Cain with a fury that shook even those who had once doubted him, his words sharp, his accusations relentless. He demanded to know what had happened to his mother, demanded to know why she had been reduced to this state, demanded the truth that Cain refused to acknowledge. The denials were empty, the lies transparent, and though proof was scarce, Billy's conviction gave him power. For every ounce of arrogance Cain displayed, Billy countered with raw determination, his anger a weapon sharper than anything Cain could wield. And so, a battle line was drawn. It was no longer simply about business, no longer about rivalry, no longer about family dynamics. This was about survival, about protecting Jill, about uncovering the twisted games Cain had set in motion. Billy was ready to dismantle every piece of Cain's world, to strip away every illusion, to expose him for the monster he was. He would do it not just as a son avenging his mother but as a man who had finally found his strength in the face of cruelty. The war in Nice was only beginning, but one truth had already become clear: Cain had gone too far, and Billy was no longer a man willing to stand in the shadows. For so long Jill had fought battles with her words, her sharp instincts, and her undeniable willpower. She had built a reputation as someone who could stand toe-to-toe with the most manipulative men and women in Genoa City, but Cain was different. Cain was not simply a rival or a nuisance, he was a predator, lurking with a smile, waiting for the moment when her guard was down. In recent months, every interaction between them had escalated into heated arguments, their voices rising, their tempers flaring, until finally Jill realized that there was no reasoning with him. He was no longer the man who once tried to prove his worth to the family. He had evolved, or perhaps devolved, into something darker, something far more dangerous. Every time they fought, she could feel him pushing closer to a line she had prayed he would never cross. What haunted Jill most was not simply Cain's arrogance, but his sense of entitlement. He clung to the words of Colin, his late father, as if they were scripture, as if Colin's dying breaths had conferred upon him some divine right to Jill's fortune and everything tied to it. Colin had been a scoundrel, a man whose life was defined by schemes and betrayals, and yet Cain treated his words as holy. He claimed that Colin had promised him control, that Colin's vision had been for Cain to inherit not just wealth but power, and with every mention of that twisted inheritance, Jill could feel her world shaking beneath her feet. She tried to reason with him, tried to remind him that Colin's legacy was nothing more than manipulation wrapped in false charm, but Cain would not hear it. To him, Colin's word was law, and Jill was simply standing in the way of what was rightfully his. Billy had not been present for these battles. He had been living his own life, distant from the toxic storms that seemed to follow Jill wherever she went. For years, his relationship with his mother had been complicated, poisoned by her doubts in him, her tendency to see him as reckless, irresponsible, and perpetually disappointing. Billy had long ago stopped trying to convince her otherwise. He wore her disdain like armor, pretending it no longer stung, pretending that her low expectations gave him freedom. But when Jill stumbled into his life in Nice, broken and bloodied, there was no escaping the bond between them. Her body told a story of torment, her silence screamed louder than any words, and in that moment Billy realized that she had come not just for safety, not just for comfort, but with a message. The message was clear even if she could not speak it: stay away from Cain. He is not just a man twisted by ambition, he is a monster, and his hunger knows no bounds. It was a mother's final act of protection, a warning given through pain and sacrifice. Jill had faced Cain alone, had fought him with every ounce of strength she had, but she knew she could not defeat him. She was outmatched, not physically perhaps, but by the depth of his obsession and the cruelty he was willing to embrace. And so she had done the only thing she could. She had dragged herself across continents, through danger, to fall into Billy's arms, hoping that he would understand what she could not say out loud. Billy struggled with the weight of that unspoken message. His mind whirled with anger, his body shook with the urge to act, but deep down he had no desire to destroy Cain, no fantasy of taking him down in some brutal showdown. Billy had never seen Cain as anything more than a nuisance on the periphery of his life, a man he could tolerate only because they had no real connection, no friendship, no shared trust. They were not allies, not enemies in the truest sense, but strangers forced into orbit around each other by family ties and circumstance. Billy had never cared enough about Cain to imagine exacting revenge, and yet now Cain had forced himself into Billy's story in the worst possible way. Cain, meanwhile, believed himself victorious. In his mind, he was merely claiming what was his. Jill had been a barrier, a wall that refused to fall, but even walls could crack. To him, her resistance was futile, her protests meaningless. He spoke openly of his claim to her fortune, declaring to anyone who would listen that he was the true heir, the one destined to carry Colin's legacy forward. In his arrogance, he dismissed Jill's pain as collateral damage, as though bruises and broken bones were nothing compared to the prize he sought. He did not fear Jill, for he had already broken her down. He did not fear Billy either, for he did not consider Billy a worthy opponent. Cain saw himself as untouchable, a man who had risen above the judgments of family, the whispers of the past, and the accusations that clung to him. In his mind, he had already won. But what Cain had not accounted for was the resilience that comes from desperation. Jill's flight to Nice was not simply a retreat, it was a declaration that she would not surrender her son to Cain's darkness. Even unconscious, even weak, her presence was a catalyst for Billy. For the first time in years, Billy looked at his mother and felt something other than resentment. He saw in her battered body the cost of standing against evil, the proof that sometimes even the strongest could not win alone. He realized that her plea was not just for him to keep his distance from Cain but to protect himself, to step into the role of a son who could finally prove he was not the disappointment she believed him to be. The battle lines were no longer about wealth or inheritance, no longer about who deserved what. This was about survival, about stopping a man who had crossed every moral boundary, who used blood ties and twisted promises as weapons. Billy's fury began to take shape not as a thirst for revenge but as a vow. He would not let Cain destroy his mother's life, nor would he let him corrupt the family legacy with Colin's poison. Jill had given her warning, and Billy had heard it loud and clear. Cain was a monster, and monsters had to be confronted, not ignored. And yet, even as Billy steeled himself for what was to come, Cain continued to bask in his illusion of triumph. His smirk, his dismissive tone, his relentless insistence that Jill's fortune was his by right, all of it revealed the dangerous blend of entitlement and delusion that drove him. He believed Jill had no more fight left, that Billy had no interest in opposing him, that the future was his to mold in Colin's shadow. What he could not see was that the very act of breaking Jill had awakened something fierce in Billy, something that would not rest until Cain was exposed for what he truly was. The stage was set in Nice for a reckoning, not one born of friendship or rivalry, but of betrayal, greed, and a mother's desperate warning to her son. Jill had shown Billy the cost of facing Cain alone, and now Billy would decide whether to carry her burden, to confront the monster she could not defeat, and to finally step into a battle he had never intended to fight.